The German tanks are charging across the Ardennes. The Dutch are falling to pieces. The Belgians, likewise, their forts along the Albert Canal near Liège have been overrun. The Belgian
Yeah, to be
armies.
fair, I don't feel like you can really blame the Belgians for capitulating so quickly. It's a pretty small country. I blame the Dutch much more. I mean, that's 5 days is embarrassing. Come on.
Yeah, you gotta stick it out a little longer than that. The Danes managed 6 hours, which, given their situation, I think we shouldn't blink at. People did die in that, amazingly. Um,
Mostly of heart attacks.
yes. So you have from May 12th to the 15th a couple relatively major battles being fought. In Belgium, the French get to fight the battle that they were expecting to fight against the German Army Group B, that was coming across Belgium, which was basically the distraction force. So the Allies didn't know it.
They should have been tipped off by it being named Army Group B. I mean,
That's right.
kind of obvious. Where's A?
A is the one that's unfortunately charging through the Ardennes.
That's like SEAL Team 6.
I would have switched it around a little bit. I would have been using different letters. Army Group F, where's Army Group E, but what can you do? So Army Group B collides with the bulk of the French armored forces at a town called Hanut in Belgium, in Flanders, near Namur. And it's an inconclusive battle, but the Germans are repulsed. They're held up for a couple days. The French... It shows that the French mechanized units, when they were organized and fighting, in the way they expected to fight, on ground of their choosing, they could hold their own. And then you have a battle the next day at Gembloux, also in that gap between Brussels and Namur, where the first Moroccan division of the French army repulses a German armored attack with pretty significant losses. So 2 bright spots for the French. There's not going to be many more coming here, so treasure those. Because at the same time, the German army has made it through the Ardennes. They were spotted by Allied pilots, but incredibly, General Gamelin at his headquarters in the Chateau de Vincennes in Paris, which did not have a radio or telephone connection, incredibly. He had to send messengers other places. He didn't believe in that sort of thing, I guess. Just
Very
baffling.
modern.
Incredible.
We didn't need it in World War One. Why would we need it in World War II?
Precisely. But he dismisses these reports as being impossible and believes it's probably a distraction from the main event in Belgium. By 12th of May, the German tanks the entire German Air Force is concentrating its activities on Sedan, where the 55th Division, without its anti-tank and anti-aircraft guns, with its poorly trained conscripts, is holed up in their trenches, just absolutely getting blown to pieces. Morale is in shambles. They put up almost no resistance as the Germans breach the Meuse River, throw up bridges, and tanks begin pouring down into France, and there's almost nothing there to stop them. So for a couple days, you have inconclusive fighting going back and forth south of Sedan. At the same time, other French units are breaching the river. German units, I'm sorry, are crossing the river in different places, and the situation is rapidly getting out of control. French communication is extremely poor. Gamelin at headquarters has almost no idea where his units are, what they're doing. Communications have broken down. They're depending in many cases on the civilian telephone network to communicate. Those wires are being cut.
Just going into people's houses asking, "Hey, can I use the phone to call my?"
There are
troops?
literal cases of this happening. It's unbelievable. I guess it's one of those things I should have mentioned in the material preparation. Desperate shortage of radios in the French army. A major weakness of a lot of the French tanks is that they don't have radios, or they have radios that can only receive but not send. The Germans, on the other hand, had really put a lot of emphasis on this point. They had plenty of radios, and that's part of because they just were doctrinally a lot better prepared. They encouraged initiative at the local level, whereas the French doctrine kind of called for very tight, centralized control from above, based on the experience of World War I. A lower-level German commander had more freedom of action to exploit opportunities, and that's part of the reason why once they got into open country, the French were just being continually outmaneuvered.
I also just wanted to say on the Gamelin point, for all of his faults, he wasn't Pétain, right? Like this guy
That is true.
This guy did not advocate for political discontentment in the army ranks when the left was elected, and he was tried during Vichy unlike Pétain, who would be in charge of Vichy. But
Yeah.
anyway, I don't mean to jump ahead, but I just mean there's a lot of bad guys in these stories.
Yeah. Gamelin is more the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time, more than anything. I think he was a talented organizer. He was not a combat leader.
Yeah.
It's probably the best way to understand that. So anyway, from here, over the next 10 days, it's the German drive to the sea. By the 20th of May, they've reached the Channel coast at Calais, and the entire British Expeditionary Force and French First Army and Seventh Army, which had advanced into Belgium, were now surrounded with their backs to the sea. Along the way, you have Charles de Gaulle manages to distinguish himself in combat, launches one of the couple French armored counterattacks at Montcornet, a local success that doesn't really have a lot of impact on the speed of events, but still gets the attention of major figures in government. And so in the next couple of days, Reynaud will actually bring him in to serve as the Undersecretary of State for War. So he'll be
He's
flying.
a colonel at this point, right?
He gets promoted to brigadier general. And then he's made, he had a very rapid rise to prominence in these couple days. He was already known. He had fought in World War I. He had been captured in World War I, actually, and spent most of the war in a prison camp. But he was a well-known theoretician. He had written a lot of books on armored warfare during the 30s, some of which the German generals are said to have read. He was nicknamed General Motors by some of his colleagues in the French army for his obsession with motorization. But yeah, it shows that he was kind of on the theoretical cutting edge at that time. I will give him credit for that. But yeah, so from 20th May onwards, we have now the famous evacuation of the British troops from Dunkirk, along with several thousand French troops who will then be turned around and brought right back to France, disembarked at different ports, which must have been a fairly traumatic experience. Something that I've never seen mentioned, but it is crazy that thousands of guys were pulled off the beach under bombing and shelling at Dunkirk and then turned right around within 2 or 3 days and thrown back into the line along the Somme.
So France didn't think that clearly Britain thought it was game over at this point.
Yes,
France,
but
France didn't think so. They weren't willing to, because clearly there had been some argument to evacuate as many French troops as possible to Britain.
Yes.
No, and
so there was arguably one missed opportunity during this period. On May 20th, as this collapse became total, Reynaud finally sacks Gamelin, has him fired. This is, unfortunately, at the one moment where Gamelin had actually shown some sort of strategic initiative and was trying to coordinate an attack southward by the British troops in the pocket to link up with French troops pushing northward from the Somme, with the idea that they could then actually encircle the German tanks along the channel. Not clear that the material wherewithal really existed, but there was at least a chance to link up and allow some of those units to escape the pocket. But it was at this exact moment that he was fired. He was replaced with General Weygand, who was previously mentioned, a man now 71 years old, a World War I veteran, but well past his prime. He was recalled from Syria, where he had been in charge of preparing French troops for all of these insane schemes against the Caucasus. But yeah, he takes command. It takes him a few days to get things organized, so whatever opportunity existed for that counterattack disappeared. He does, however, pioneer a change in the doctrine. He adopts what was referred to as the hedgehog strategy, where he basically says, rather than attempting to hold a single continuous front line, which we can't do because the Germans are too mobile, we're going to dig in all the different forests and villages, and we're just going to form circular defensive perimeters to hold important crossroads. And when the Germans surround you, we're going to counterattack, and that's the idea. It's more of a defense in depth with multiple layers, and the idea is that they're going to anchor this along the Somme River, north of Paris, where the remaining half of the French army is beginning to dig in. This worked relatively well for the first few days. You have kind of a 5-day pause at the beginning of June when Dunkirk finally falls, where the French are digging in on the Somme, preparing for Act 2. They did not consider it game over. With the recent memory in World War I that in 1914, in the first couple months, the Germans came very close to taking Paris, actually. It was only by rushing soldiers north on commandeered taxi cabs and buses that they orchestrated the miracle on the Marne in 1914. So they had reason to believe that they'd survived catastrophe early in World War I, they could probably survive catastrophe early in World War II. The problem was that by this point they had just lost so many men in the early debacles along the border in Belgium. They lost a ton of their equipment, probably the majority of their tanks. I'd have to find the exact numbers. There just wasn't really the material wherewithal to be able to stand up to the German army, which had taken, to this point, very slim losses. And so on June 5th, the Germans launch what's called Case Red, Act 2, basically, aimed at capturing Paris and knocking the French out for good. They try to cross the Somme. For 3 days, they have a really tough go of it. The French have had some time to prepare. They've recuperated a bit. The shock of the German tanks and aircraft has kind of worn off, and so there's less panicked retreats, but they're now outnumbered and outgunned, and so by June 8th, the line is broken and the Germans are on their way to Paris. And that will get us into the last act, which is sort of where we see Pétain begin his political maneuvering against the Third Republic. So here, this is going to get into a bit more of the political maneuvering, so you can chime in with your knowledge about the Third Republic and how some of those different posts functioned. So, in the midst of all of this, around the time that there's the change in command, Reynaud also decides to summon Philippe Pétain back from Spain and makes him deputy prime minister.
A
The idea
great
being that
choice.
the idea, yep, here is a hero of World War One who's widely admired.
Yeah, he has a whole constituency. I mean, it's
Yeah,
crazy.
even among, it seems to me that he was seen as a right wing figure. People understood that, but I think people on the left didn't fully appreciate how sympathetic to fascism he was. And among the rank and file, he seemed to have a lot of admirers, and especially among the World War I veterans, which were, a hugely influential political constituency at that time.
Well, and this war for France at the time is about their nation. It is about defending France.
Right.
That's not incompatible with right wing or fascistic thought, right?
No, not at all. And yeah, the idea, I guess, it's a broad, united front now. So we've gone from a popular front to a national. Ooh, I don't want to say national front. That sends the wrong idea. But a united front that draws in diverse political influences. There's now a cabinet that includes right wing ministers and socialists. I guess I should throw in as an aside the sad fate of the Communist Party during this period. The Communist Party, the PCF, during the 30s had been very anti-German because they were in the United Front, the Popular Front. They saw what the Nazis were doing to their German comrades, and they were very actually influential in backing the rearmament programs. And then there is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviet Union and Germany, and orders come in from Moscow that the Communist Party in France should no longer be anti-German. And when Germany invades Poland, the communists initially the French communists, like the rest of the French left, is united in opposing the German aggression. A few days later, they suddenly have to change their tune. This is now an inter-imperialist war. It's a capitalist conflict. Workers shouldn't be participating in it. This didn't go over well. There was a mass flight of membership. Tens of thousands of communist members resigned over this, threw in their party cards. A lot of deputies in parliament disowned the party. That did not save them from being labeled now an interior, a threat, a subversive organization. So the Communist Party is banned, its newspaper is shut down, its members are arrested, and its leadership goes into exile. So yeah,
Quite unfortunate that was the Soviet line at the time. But the
it
Communist
yeah
Party would then play a pretty big role in the resistance, right?
critical role in the resistance. Yeah. And frustratingly, this is another one of those right-wing myths that you still hear a lot in France, actually. I've never seen a shred of evidence for. Just like they argue that the Popular Front disarmed France, they like to make this claim that the communists were carrying out acts of sabotage in the factories, that they were actively undermining the war effort. And I have never found a single case where this appeared to have occurred. There were many accusations made, obviously, but
It seems very incompatible with the party disbanding effectively.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously there was a huge fear among the French right about the communist cells in the factories that still existed. They set up a whole internal security bureau to combat this. On the front lines, they were very vigilant about communist literature being distributed, which did happen on some occasions. There was anti-war literature, but it was not very common. It was less than was anticipated. Interestingly, the Germans did try to jump on this. They had a clandestine radio station based in Stuttgart, which was called Radio Humanité, named after the communist newspaper in France, and they basically posed as a French communist exile radio station, encouraging
Wow.
French troops to desert, to cross over to German lines, to surrender, which is interesting. I've never seen any evidence that was very successful.
Now, I wonder what happened if you did.
Ugh, I mean, you became a prisoner, I suppose. I don't think they did anything too nefarious if you were a white, non-Jewish Frenchman. But yeah, anyway, so that was just an aside about the Communist Party during this period. So yeah, with the breakthrough on the Somme, the French army is now in disarray. They can't hold the front line anymore. Resistance is disintegrating. From this point on, Weygand has basically given up on fighting the war. No one knows if this is true. It's claimed in one of de Gaulle's biographies. They asked Weygand what the plan was, and Weygand said to fight them on the Somme and on the Marne. And de Gaulle said, okay, and what happens if they break through on the Somme and the Marne? And Weygand replies, well, then it's over. The man survived the war, and so he claimed that conversation never took place. It's a he said situation.
Regardless of whether the conversation itself was true, the thought behind it is true, I think.
Yeah, it's certainly based on his behavior. From June 11th, he was already advocating for an armistice. On the 10th, the government evacuates from Paris, burns all their papers, begins heading south towards Orléans. Pétain now is also, well, he probably was already, by the time he was brought in, was pretty skeptical about the chances for continued resistance. Now he is actively also pushing for an armistice, plotting with Weygand. On the drive from Paris to Briare, which is a castle near Orléans where the French government temporarily met, Pétain rode along with Admiral Darlan, who was the top admiral of the French Navy, and began talking about how France needed a consulate like what it had after the Revolution, when Napoleon and other leading figures established dictatorial control. So, again, this is the deputy prime minister now plotting. On 11th June, there's a meeting of the Supreme Allied War Council at this castle in Briare. Churchill demands that the French mount a defense of Paris, that they sandbag the streets, that they fight building by building, which one can only imagine the destruction that would have occurred. The French are pretty much unanimous in opposing that because they don't want to see Paris destroyed. But Pétain and Weygand especially say that there's not enough troops for it and that there's no point. Weygand says at this point he can't guarantee that the lines will hold for another 24 hours, and now this is the first time that Pétain openly states that further resistance is useless and calls for an armistice. Meanwhile, Reynaud, the French prime minister, is considering instead that the French government could evacuate metropolitan France altogether and set up shop in Algiers, in French Algeria, and pursue the war from North Africa. Most of the government ministers and Churchill are in favor of this plan. If France can't be held, that it will continue the war from abroad.
Makes a lot of sense.
But the generals are opposed to it. They argue that it will result in complete occupation and devastation of metropolitan France. They believe if they get an armistice now, they could have peace with honor, that at least part of France could be saved from German occupation, and that they would be able to avoid the stain on the reputation of the French army, which was their personal aim. That they believed that this was a failure of the politicians and not the army, that they didn't want to be blamed for it, that, all of this and that. And Weygand also fears that if the government leaves metropolitan France, it will open up a power vacuum like what happened when Napoleon III was captured in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, when the Germans swept through France and when the French Commune, the Paris Commune, rose up and the left gained control of Paris and unleashed chaos and anarchy in the minds of the French right.
Right. Makes sense that your main concern when France is under immediate threat of fascist rule is that there might be a left-wing uprising. That's the real
it really
danger.
shows the mindset there.
Do we know what Charles de Gaulle was thinking at this time?
De Gaulle was also in favor of evacuation to North Africa. he believed that the main thing on de Gaulle and Reynaud's position was that they believed they could receive material aid from the U.S. in terms of arms to be able to reconstitute the French army in North Africa, where they had they had 100,000 some men in North Africa.
Well, a lot of their men were coming from there in the first place.
Yes, a lot of the troops were coming from there. They knew they could raise more troops from the colonies, so they believed that if Britain carried on the fight from the British Isles, if the French evacuated to their colonies, and if they received armaments from the U.S., that they could reconstitute themselves and continue the war.
So we said earlier that this was a broad front, right? Everyone was fighting for the nation of France, if you will. What does it say about the people who wanted to, quote unquote, preserve France by capitulating versus I see as a more Gaullist standpoint of like there's no point in a France that's not a full France.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it shows that it shows the preoccupation among the right wing, what do you say, Catholic, integralist, fascist friendly parts of the right believed that France had been in a situation of decline for decades due to left wing and communist influence. And they believed that this was a chance for national purification almost. They believed that the fascist model was being proved successful by the German military success against the decadent Western democracies, right? So they liked the model they saw in fascist Italy and Francoist Spain, and they believed that they could work out a deal with the Germans to be able to build up something on that model in France. And it was still a revanchist idea. Even at the senior levels of Vichy, there was the idea that the French were preparing for an eventual war of revenge against the Germans. Like what had happened after 1870 when they were forced to cede Alsace and Lorraine.
They didn't actually want to be Nazi puppets. They just thought that was a better temporary solution.
Exactly. But yeah, it's a bit of a it's funny because they love as much as they love to make the stab in the back claim that it was the left that was responsible for the defeat in 1940. I mean, these are the guys who are actively plotting.
They quite literally, yeah.
Because for all of the conservatism that you might be able to attribute to Charles de Gaulle and Gaullism in the 60s, it wasn't he wasn't willing to go along with the fascists.
No. Even though he was personally, he was quite a conservative officer, and that's why he had been the odd man out and the reason why he didn't rise to high rank until the war started in 1939-40, because the government had been kind of scared of him, because he was, advocating for this small professional army, presumably, at least in their minds, sort of ideologically right-wing, and he was seen as a aristocratic Catholic figure, So it's interesting, that he did not. He in fact clashed very much with Weygand, with Pétain. They did not have a good relationship. Although it's hard to have a good relationship with Charles de Gaulle, from what I understand. So.
Well, I mean, the U.S., as I'm sure we'll get into, I mean, the U.S. Was so against Charles de Gaulle that they were almost happier with fascist France.
Yes, that is true. So in the next couple days from here, we see rapid unraveling, really even psychological unraveling of the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud. You have the final meeting of the Supreme Allied War Council on 13th June in Tours, because the government is continuing the retreat south as the Germans advance. He is now under just constant pressure from the high command, from Pétain and Weygand, to seek an armistice. He's also personally under the influence of his mistress, Hélène de Portes, who's been overemphasized in some histories, but is still kind of noteworthy. She was a countess, a weird aristocratic figure, a great admirer of Mussolini, close personal friends with the Italian ambassador, and a rabid Anglophobe. And she just at this meeting, for some reason, was there for the first. I don't know what.
Great person to have around.
Yeah, staged like a 20+ minute tantrum, apparently sobbing and screaming, and according to one account of this, tried to stab Winston Churchill with a dagger, which I personally don't believe happened, but is a colorful story. But she had to be physically ejected from the room by 2 French naval officers. But it's worth keeping in mind that if that's what's happening publicly, he is being constantly assailed by this behind closed doors, and it's probably having some impact on his psychological state. Anyway, under all this pressure, Reynaud now tells Churchill that France will be, quote, physically unable to sustain the war without outside intervention. And he says that without a promise of support and intervention from the United States, he may be forced to seek an armistice with the Germans. He still is supporting the evacuation of North Africa, but now only on the condition of a guarantee of support from the US, who to this point has not been willing to get involved.
And what is the British involvement at this point? All the troops are gone from France. Is there still air support?
Yes, but never as much as the French want, and this is like a constant point of friction here. Is the French are constantly demanding that the British. First of all, there was supposed to be a second wave of the BEF, which was meant to be sent to France in June, which is now being held back in Britain. And yeah, and they're refusing to send more fighter squadrons. The French are constantly clamoring for more fighter squadrons, but their troops are being bombed and are basically defenseless from the air. But the British, now kind of writing off the French mainland, at least, are holding all their planes back against eventual German retaliation. So
you can sort of understand why Churchill's insistence that they fight to the last street of Paris and, evacuate the government to Algeria would be not received very well when the British themselves are not doing anything.
Yeah, it's really frustrating in a lot of the Anglophone narratives. I feel like that it's like the French are seen as having quit, rampant defeatism, having thrown in the towel. It's like, well, they were out there on their own, really. I mean, they were doing all the dying, and it was common. I think it was an exact quote from Pétain, but I'm sure it was a widely held idea that the British were fighting to the last Frenchman, effectively.
Yeah, yeah, and again, the British had evacuated over a month before the French finally capitulated. The French did continue to fight without British support.
It's a completely forgotten thing, because in the Anglophone history, the narrative stops at Dunkirk. Like, that's it. Like, the Battle of France was lost, ignoring, that the war continued for a month. And actually, during that month is when the Germans suffered 75% of the casualties that they suffered during this campaign, because the hedgehog tactics were actually much, much more effective, and they weren't, but the French fought, and they fought, at least during that first 2-week period, very hard. It's a little unjust, I think, the narrative that's emerged as dominant. It's in part because the French military leadership, before the civilian leadership, had already resigned themselves to defeat, and unfortunately I think that is not a good look.
No, definitely not.
After Tours, the government had to continue retreating further southward. By June 15th, they were now set up in Bordeaux. They're getting close to as far south as you can go now. Reynaud has now had kind of another idea pop into his head. He's now advocating for the Dutch model. He's now advocating for the army to capitulate while the government evacuates either to North Africa or to England to continue the war. Weygand just says he absolutely will not go along with this, that he will not evacuate. He considers it to be a stain on the reputation of the army.
Whereas losing is not a stain on the reputation of the army?
They're seeking a gentleman's peace now,
Very nice
gentleman's
country.
peace. We round up all the Jews, shake hands, it's all fine.
Right. At this stage, Pétain himself intervenes. He threatens to resign if Reynaud does not agree to seek an armistice. At this time, the other ministers assembled there. I mean, you still have the French president, Albert Lebrun. You have the presidents of the Senate and of the Chamber of Deputies who are there. They still back Reynaud. They still oppose an armistice. But Reynaud now is increasingly paralyzed, and he's slowly losing support. Ministers are slowly beginning to resign themselves to defeat. And then you get this last kind of bizarre turn on June 16th, where Churchill's idea on how to perk up the French is to propose a Franco-British union, that they would unite the two governments.
The worst nightmare of France forever.
Yeah.
Churchill needed some French cultural sensitivity officers to help him with.
It comes off like an American in Afghanistan.
It's a bizarre idea. It's fascinating. It's clearly at this stage mostly symbolic. Reynaud reads this out to the ministers in their final meeting on 16th June, and basically is met with silence. Just no one really has anything to say about that. So finally, receiving no support from the US, Reynaud goes and tenders his resignation to Lebrun and suggests that in a shocking turn, suggests that Pétain should be allowed to form a new government and assume the role of prime minister because France needs a unifying figure.
Liam, could you read in French this quote here, this radio quote, kind of in like a Pétain voice?
Yes.
Gosh, I don't really know what Pétain sounds like. I don't think I've seen that many.
Old.
Old.
Faut cesser le combat. I don't know.
I can translate it here. I'm not sure.
Sure.
Worth reading it in French to our pig audience who doesn't speak French.
Our hog
Uneducated
audience.
swine, yeah. On June 17th, Pétain broadcast a speech on the radio saying, "We must cease the fight. I spoke tonight with the enemy to demand if they were ready to reach an agreement with us between soldiers after the fight and honorably God, I'm really bad at this.
It's hard to do it word for word.
Yes, Patrick always makes me do this, and
it's become a trademark.
We must stop the fight. I have talked with the enemy tonight to demand if they are willing to search with us among soldiers after the fight and honorably the means of coming to an end of the hostilities." Basically saying that he's gone behind the back of his own government and spoken to the enemy, right?
And what's funny is actually, so the armistice, like negotiations would open in the days after this, after Renaud has resigned, after Pétain has assumed governmental authority. But yeah, they actually had a problem of French troops heard this on the radio and basically just started throwing down their weapons, and then their officers had to be like, no, like the armistice hasn't actually happened yet. It was seen as like a leverage thing that they couldn't let the Germans occupy every major city, or else there's no reason to negotiate an armistice. They've just won.
Talk about shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah. The next day, de Gaulle, who slipped away on a plane to London on the morning of the 17th, kind of seeing the way things were going, makes his own speech broadcast by the BBC, calling for continued resistance, calling for the French to rally to him to carry on the fight. This has become now very famous in his own. The text is inscribed in gold lettering beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, actually, if you've ever been. So yeah, for this he is labeled a traitor and a renegade, and will eventually get a warrant for his death from the new government coming to power in Vichy.
This must have been important, right? That he did this just a day after, Pétain drops this kind of bombshell.
100%. And I haven't taken any quotes from the de Gaulle speech here, but it's kind of interesting. You can go and look it up. I think it's been translated. He was not a very charismatic speaker, Charles de Gaulle, at least not at this stage. And his speech is sort of very technical. He kind of goes and outlines. He's like, we have lost because the enemy has done a better job making use of mechanized forces and air power. It's a very kind of he explains, this is why we lost, this is what we can do, he says, and he's kind of very prescriptive. He's like, we still have the resources of our colonies, we have our British allies, and we can receive the industrial backing of the United States. It's a very point by point speech. It's not really very flowery. It's instead saying, there's a way that we can win. This is how we do it. Come and fight with me, sort of speech.
So is this for his soldiers, or is it
question? But what soldiers? Because soldiers in metropolitan France can't just evacuate the country on their own and go to London.
Right. I mean, it was for the general population. Yes, he's calling on everyone who's abroad in the UK to rally to him. I guess the crews on French ships, for instance, and then critically, this speech is meant to also be heard in the French colonies by the leadership there, both military and civilian. And so that's going to end up being the struggle over the next 2 years for de Gaulle, is to win the allegiance of these different colonial authorities in each part of the French Empire and bring them over to the Free French side.
But that brings us to occupied France and Vichy France, which I think is probably a good subject for another whole episode.
Yeah,
with you, Sam.
I don't have anything to say about it. So
yeah, and Patrick has a lot to say about the legal structures. I know that's something.
Yeah, we finally get back to your core material here, so that'll be.
Yeah, I think we could do a whole episode on Vichy that and if Sam, you're willing, we could prepare ahead of time, kind of do another detailed plan on it.
Yes, 100%. I think even these turbulent first couple days are worth a couple minutes, because I don't have notes here, but even before he had solidified power, Pétain was having gendarmes rounding up the other ministers and problematic left-wing deputies. It's interesting kind of coup d'etat. You can almost go minute by minute with some of it. So
I think we'll leave it there on a cliffhanger for the audience.
oh yes.
I want to thank Sam very much for coming on our show. I mean, this has been enlightening for me, and I hope it will be as well to our audience. And you're obviously welcome to come back on anytime, Sam.
Absolutely a pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Sam.
I love to ramble, and I've done more of it here than I have for many, many, many months, I think. So thank you for putting up with me, and for the listeners who have hung in there to the end of this one, because I've done a hell of a lot of talking. Jesus Christ.
Sam, do you have anything you want to plug?
Do I have any current projects? You can actually find me on Substack, I guess. Attach my real name to that. I'm not that afraid. You can look me up. It's Political Risk Dispatches on Substack if you want to see some of my rambling about political events in Europe and defense issues. I write like 3 times a year when I finally get around to it.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's it for us at the Royal Palace Podcast. We'll see you on the next episode.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.